Curly Joe DeRita is an infamous figure amongst fans of the Three Stooges. The comedic performer came from a burlesque background and was the last person to join the beloved troupe before its disbandment. Today, Curly Joe is widely considered to be the least loved of the 6 men that acted as members of the Three Stooges. Join Factsverse as we explore why Curly Joe DeRita badmouthed the Stooges until he died. Curly Joe DeRita was the worst Stooge ever. The Three Stooges was an incredibly popular comedic troupe around for nearly half of a century, with the first iteration of the troupe appearing in the early 20s, and the last iteration not disbanding until 1970. All iterations of the Three Stooges shared 2 members in common, Moe Howard and Larry Fine. Initially, Shemp Howard, Moe's brother, joined Moe and Larry in their comedic exploits. There were 6 members of the Stooges over the course of the troupe's lifespan, and the remaining 3 members were all performers brought in to replace Shemp Howard. Of these performers, Joe DeRita is the one that Three Stooges fans generally agree was the worst Stooge ever. Joe DeRita was Shemp's last replacement. The first person brought on to replace Shemp Howard was his and Moe's older brother Curly. Curly Howard became a beloved part of the troupe, and many fans consider the Stooges' work with Curly to be even more iconic than their early days. Shemp came back to replace Curly later, and the 2 remaining members were brought in afterwards to replace him. However, the last 2 replacements were much less beloved. Following the Three Stooges' second loss of Shemp, the third Stooge became Joe Besser. Many fans consider Besser to be the worst member that ever performed with the Stooges, but that's only because Curly Joe DeRita was such a forgettable late addition to the troupe that there are many fans who either continue to forget he even exists or don't consider him a real member. Curly Joe joined the Three Stooges just after the troupe ceased production of their classic shorts. Because of this, he only appears in their widely maligned theatrical films, as well as the live-action intros for the cartoon show. DeRita started out as a burlesque comedian. Curly Joe DeRita was born July 12, 1909 in Philadelphia. His father went by the name Wardell. His mother's maiden name was DeRita, and she was a professional dancer. When it came time for Joe to start performing on his own as an adult, he took his mother's last name to stand out. Joe's father was a stagehand, and being at the theater during the early years of his life led Joe to start performing at a young age. As an adult, he made the decision to transition over to burlesque comedy. Joe joins the USO during World War II. Joe DeRita made his entry into the burlesque circuit as a comedian in the 1920s, and World War II was around the corner. The fledgling comedian feared the war might put an end to his aspirations, but it actually opened up new opportunities for him. He ended up joining the USO, which allowed him to tour the globe and perform alongside notable luminaries like Bing Crosby. Joe's time with Columbia Pictures. Following Joe's return to America, the burlesque comedian continued honing his act while dreaming of bigger things. In the 1940s, he slowly started transitioning into filmed entertainment. In 1944, he had an uncredited role in a comedic film, The Doughgirls. A few years later, he was snatched up by Columbia Pictures to film a series of comedic shorts. He filmed several of them during the latter half of the 1940s, even receiving headlining billing on a few. Joe didn't speak fondly of these shorts later in life. Of course, somewhere else on the Columbia Studios lot, the Three Stooges were filming their own comedic shorts. Did the Three Stooges approach Joe before? Rumor has it the Three Stooges approached Joe to become a fourth Stooge during his days filming shorts for Columbia, and that the burlesque comedian turned them down because he wasn't interested in changing his style to fit with theirs. Before his death, DeRita denied these rumors, but it stands to reason the Three Stooges would have been well aware of his existence. It wasn't until 1959 that Joe DeRita finally made his debut as the new third member of the Three Stooges. That was in Have Rocket Will Travel. Before we tell you more about Joe, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Factsverse if you haven't already. Joe DeRita never wanted to change. DeRita allegedly despised the short subjects he had filmed for Columbia Pictures. They featured slapstick-oriented comedy, while Joe preferred his own brand of burlesque humor. According to Joe, anyone could have performed in those Columbia shorts and gotten a laugh just as well as him due to the basic nature of the material. Once Joe's contract with Columbia came to an end, the burlesque comedian was free to start doing what he loved once more. Sadly, burlesque comedy fell out of fashion in the 50s, and the end of the decade found Joe changing his image completely to fit in with that of the Three Stooges. The Three Stooges' classic lineup falls apart. According to many, the most classic lineup of the Three Stooges consisted of Moe, Larry, and Curly. But as established, the original lineup was Moe, Larry, and Shemp. Shemp left the Three Stooges during its early years because he wanted to pursue a solo career. That's when Curly was brought on, solidifying the iconic lineup. Curly became the third Stooge in the early 1930s and continued in that role until 1946. That year, he suffered a debilitating stroke. Curly passed away in 1952, making him the first of the 6 Stooges to do so. From 1946 until his own death in 1955, Shemp Howard acted as the third Stooge once again, reuniting the troupe's original lineup. Following his death of a heart attack in 1955, Joe Besser replaced him, with Joe being another comedic performer who had a history of filming shorts with Columbia Pictures. Joe became the new third Stooge in 1956, and the Stooges continued filming shorts for Columbia until the next year. While this meant the troupe was out of a steady gig on screen, they still had their stage performances to get by on. But in 1958, Joe quit the troupe to take care of his sick wife. At that point, Moe and Larry seriously kicked around the idea of calling it quits. However, a chance encounter reminded Larry of the existence of Joe DeRita. Burlesque comedy was no longer as lucrative as it had been, and Joe was looking for work. So the stars aligned for him to become the third Stooge. The Three Stooges became a hit with the kids. Although the Stooges were no longer successful enough with adult audiences to warrant Columbia Pictures creating new short features starring them, the studio began airing the group's classic shorts on television in 1958. As a result of this TV exposure, the Three Stooges found they'd become incredibly popular amongst children. With Joe DeRita as their new third Stooge, the troupe got the idea to make feature-length theatrical films aimed at kids. The first of these was Have Rocket Will Travel in 1959. The infamous Snow White and the Three Stooges was released in 1961. In order to fit with the Three Stooges, Joe DeRita shaved his head and became Curly Joe DeRita. The group hoped that kids wouldn't be discerning enough to realize that Curly Joe DeRita wasn't Curly Howard. And given that they were aimed at kids, these later works greatly toned down the slapstick violence featured in the classic Three Stooges shorts. Curly Joe becomes the last remaining Stooge. The Three Stooges continued performing on stage with Joe DeRita until 1970, when Larry Fine suffered a stroke. He passed away in 1975. Joe DeRita and Moe Howard kicked around the idea of replacing him, but nothing came of it. Moe ended up passing away only a few months after Larry. When the Three Stooges got their star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1983, Curly Joe was sick, so Joe Besser was the only surviving member of the troupe who could make it. But Besser ended up passing away before Curly Joe. Besser died in 1988, while Curly Joe lived until 1993. Because of this, he'll always be remembered as the last of the Stooges to die. Now it's time to hear from you. Do you remember Curly Joe DeRita from the Stooge movies? Let us know in the comments section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.